going to talk about leadership and school environment and what leaders can do that makes a difference. And I'm starting, this is not my, you may know, or you may not know at all, but I was a teacher originally and then a researcher in the university, professor of education at Durham University in the UK. And leadership was not really my research area. I was interested in other things. But I've obviously been aware of lots of research in leadership and school environment factors and so on, and generally not followed it that closely, and I guess mostly not thought that it was a great field. And I guess that's the summary of what I'm going to talk about today. I think the evidence is generally quite weak and quite unhelpful, but there is some that I think is quite good. So I'll try and explain why I think it's not great, and what is it about the bits that I think are the best bits that are a good, useful steer for school leaders. So if you are a school leader, there's lots of advice out there. That's not the problem. But is it really grounded in strong evidence about what we know is likely to be good practice? So on this slide, I am sharing with you I think this is advice for school leaders. It's not actually explicitly packaged as advice. It says this is what successful school leaders do, but I think the implication is, why would you tell us about this if it wasn't a way of sort of saying to school leaders, this is what you should do? So that's one side of the slide, and the other side of the slide is just something that I downloaded from an online horoscope the other day. And so my question is, can you guess which one is which? Which one is the research study this is actually from 3 of the leading researchers in this field who've been doing work in leadership, school leadership for 30 years or more. So which is theirs? Okay, so that's not actually genuinely a hard question, is it? You can all see that one of them is really focused on leadership, school leadership, and the other one is just sort of general stuff. But the point I'm trying to make is that these are, I think they're similar in terms of their usefulness. They're not very specific. They're quite general advice. They don't actually tell you what to do. And I think that's a little bit of a problem. So if I just take that, if I go back to this slide, so the first one, so the one on the left there, which is from this Leithwood et al. Review, recent review that says, here are the 7 strong claims that we know about leadership, and these are the things that they say leaders do. And the top one there is build a shared vision. So just to illustrate, what do I think? Why do I think that's a problem? Well, I think there are lots of different ways that we could interpret what that means. So does it mean that as a school leader, you just keep enunciating your own vision and aims for what the school should be like, and if you just say it often enough and forcibly enough and repeat it endlessly, then eventually everyone's heard it often enough and they think, oh yeah, that must be true. So that would be one way. Maybe you think you should do something more democratic and try and get everyone to exchange their views and discuss and reach a consensus. And then if we were to go down that route, we'd have to define what we mean by consensus, of course. Does that mean everybody's completely agreed, or does it just mean enough people are enough agreed, and so on? If we really want everyone to completely agree, that might be quite a time-consuming process. Or maybe you have a more authoritarian view about this shared vision, which is that you basically anyone who doesn't agree with you, you get rid of. And all of those are caricatures, I guess. They're not things that I'm suggesting leaders should do, but I do think they're possible interpretations of this advice that leaders should build a shared vision. I don't know what that means, and I don't know how they should do it. So what would be useful to have in this field, and this is another table actually from the same paper where they talk about the what they call leadership resources, in other words, the skills and knowledge and character properties and so on of leaders. And again, I think most of this is pretty unhelpful for these 3 reasons. So one is that mostly we don't really know what we're talking about. People talk about things like problems. So again, I'm just reading from the top of the list there, problem solving expertise. So let's say we're talking about the same leader that we've worked with and we know well, and you might say, well, yeah, she's really good at problem solving, and I might say, oh no, I don't think she is actually. Are we both wrong, or both right, or one of us right, the other wrong? How do we know? Because we probably mean different things when we talk about problem solving expertise. We may be drawing on different evidence and different examples and so on. So we're talking at cross purposes because we haven't got a clear operational definition of what we mean by problem solving expertise. So that's the first problem. Secondly, even if we did know what we were talking about and we defined it and we agreed what problem solving expertise means, it's important to know that it's something that can actually be changed. So if I don't have problem solving expertise, what can I do to gain it? Can I do things to gain it, I suppose? But yes, what? And the third one is that exactly. So if I do the things that I can do that help me to gain more problem solving expertise, then is there good evidence that that will lead to improvements in outcomes, like student attainment or teacher well-being or other things that we care about in a school context? So if we had those three things, then I think that would make this research field really useful. I think we have quite limited amounts of all three of them, is my judgment. So again, just to give you some examples. So there's a lot of discussion about things like distributed leadership, for example, and this quote I've put in there is actually from a systematic review of evidence about distributed leadership. So this is absolutely the focus of their review, and they say, we can do this systematic review, but we don't actually all agree what this thing means in the first place. So that seems a little bit problematic to me. One of the things that would characterize a more mature scientific approach, I think, is that we would find the same instruments being used. So if there's surveys, questionnaires, those kinds of things. But actually, it's pretty rare. In fact, I'm not sure that I can think of any examples at all. So rare is perhaps a slight understatement, but maybe there are some and I haven't found them, where an instrument is used by more than one team or a team that doesn't have people in common. And even when people do talk about these things like distributed leadership or other kinds of leadership styles, instructional leadership or whatever, sometimes there are survey instruments, and then you look at the item. Either they don't share the items, the statements in the survey, the questions in the survey, or they do, and you look at them and you think, I'm not really sure I'd call that instructional leadership or whatever it is, relational trust, whatever it is, the thing that they are interpreting it as. So that's all problematic, I think. In order to define our terms, we need to really do those things. Here's an example again, and I've chosen this one really because it's quite a prominent example by two leading researchers, Jason Grissom, Susanna Loeb, in a paper that's been widely cited, 726 citations in Google Scholar. So this is not kind of picking a sort of weak example. This is picking from, I think, the sort of top of the field. And what they did was they had a survey, 42 items, asking principals about how good they thought they were, so self-rating about different aspects of leadership. And they also asked the assistant principals in the same schools how to rate their principal and say, how good do you think the principal is? And then they did a factor analysis of their survey responses, and they picked out some factors. And one of the factors they've labeled is organization management skills. And they found a correlation between this measure and student achievement growth, and other measures as well, other perceptions about the effectiveness, the quality of the school. So I'm interested in what they've actually measured here, and is it organization management? And also there's a couple of quotes there which I think make the point that they're really claiming that this is a causal relationship, these things matter. That seems to me implicit in what they're saying there. So a consistent pattern of positive results across different outcome measures suggests these tasks matter for school performance. A policy implication is that districts seeking to identify strong candidates for principal positions may benefit from considering their organization management competencies. So they're making a direct policy implication of this. They're saying that they're making a recommendation for how people should change their behavior. So a very clear suggestion that there is this thing, organization management, it does matter, and that people should, for example, select on it. Okay, so let's look at their measure. As I said, they get this from a factor analysis of a survey result, but it's a factor that comes out of exploratory factor analysis. And one of the things about factors in factor analysis is that although some items in the survey load more heavily on that particular factor, the factor is actually the sum of a weighted sum of all the items in the survey. It isn't just the ones that load heavily. And I think in principle, that makes it quite hard to interpret what it means. So is it really about organization management? Some of the higher loading items are about that, but I'm not sure that that's quite how I would characterize it. And then interestingly, as I said, they asked the school principals to rate themselves, and they asked the assistant principals to rate the principal. So one of the things I think we would hope to see is, first of all, that the factor analysis pulls the same items out. Well, that's the diagram on the right, which is probably too small to read, but basically there's some overlap, but there's also quite a lot of items, particularly in the assistant principal survey, which are not in the principal survey coming out as loading on this factor. So I think that's a little bit odd to say that they're measuring the same thing, really, but they also don't correlate very well. So if you'd want to hope that where the assistant principals rate the principal as being good at a particular thing, then the principal, those are the same schools in which the principals also rate themselves as being good. And if that's not the case, then you'd say, well, what are we actually measuring here? Because these two different opinions about this thing don't seem to agree very well. And that, I think, is what's going on. The correlation between those two is only 0.15. So that, I think for this purpose, that's quite a low correlation, suggests there's not really a lot of agreement about whether a particular principal is in fact good at this thing. The assistant and the self-rating don't seem to correspond very well. And then because I said they find that this factor, let's call it organization management, that's what they call it, and most of the people who cite it, as far as I can see, cite it interpreting it as that unproblematically. And what do they find? Well, they find it's associated with correlations with the school accountability system, the teacher satisfaction from a survey, and parents' rating of the school. And those correlations are around 0.1. And again, that's quite a low correlation, I think, but it is comparable with other studies of similar kinds of characteristics. So maybe that's not terrible. They put it into a standardized model, standardized coefficients, predicting individual student test score gains, so standardized at the student level, and they find coefficients of 0.015 in maths, 0.012 in reading. So roughly 1.5% of a standard deviation is the impact. Well, they use the word impact. These are really just correlations. And then there's a discussion in the paper about whether this is a big effect. And they say this is about half the effect of being a subsidized lunch recipient, which is true, but that doesn't mean it's half the difference between the attainment of people who get subsidized lunch and others. This is after taking account of a whole lot of other things, including prior attainment and race, ethnicity, and gender, and a whole lot of school level variables. And the truth is that after you put things like that into a model, then subsidized lunch generally doesn't account for very much more, and neither does this organization management score, would be my interpretation of that. It's quite a weak predictor. So there's an underlying problem here, which is that throughout this literature, we're mostly interested in causal effects, and yet the kind of evidence we've got is at the weaker end, and I've tried to set out a kind of hierarchy here of what kind of evidence we'd want to see. So the lowest level is just correlations, and in particular correlations where the writers, researchers just assume that there's the causal direction in the way that they think is obvious, but they don't really justify it. So that's, I think, characteristic, for example, of that paper. Slightly better is where they do think about the possible reasons things might be correlated that might not be a causal in the obvious direction, and they try to account for those and rule them out, essentially. That would be better. Even better than that would be time series panel data. So you've got collecting attainment data, for example, over a number of years, and you can see changes in something, perhaps a change of principal in the school or those kinds of things. And so those are a bit stronger, I think, because you can see the effect coming after the cause, and that's normally the way around we like to see it, rather than just measuring at the same time point and not knowing how things pan out after. And then, of course, there are more robust evaluation designs, and I've just gone into two different categories there: non-experimental designs, strong non-experimental designs. I haven't found any of those. And then experiments, and there are, I think, two, maybe there are more than two, but that's what I've been able to track down, randomized controlled trials of leadership interventions. There must be more than that, but they're not plentiful. So what's the problem with these correlations? And again, here's just one more example. This is from, again, two more giants in this field, Leithwood and Jancy, paper in 2008. And they have really just correlational data here, which is about what they call individual and collective efficacy. In other words, this is the perception of the school leaders themselves about their ability to influence and achieve desired outcomes. So how much do they think it's up to them, whether the school does well, whether students learn and so on, and do they believe that they have the skills and knowledge and expertise and capacity to make those things happen. So that's what they mean by efficacy. These are self-perceptions. And there is literally it is a cross-section, but they also have 3 years of data, so they're able to look at something of a change over time. And they do find a correlation between the principal's perceptions of their efficacy and the attainment of the school, and a reasonable correlation, 0.26. But when they look at the change over time, over 3 years, they find no relationship between the perception of efficacy and whether a school is going up or down in its attainment. No relation at all, pretty much zero there. And they, throughout this paper, they use the word effects, and they talk about the influence of efficacy on student attainment and other outcomes. And they've got this sentence in there: our data do not permit us to make strong claims about cause and effect relationships. Nonetheless, we use the language of effects throughout as an indication of the nature of the relationships in which we were interested. So does that mean they know they can't really claim that it's an effect, cause and effect? They really shouldn't be using the word effect, because I don't think there's any way that you can use a word like effects without implying a causal relationship. I just don't think that makes any sense to me. So you shouldn't really use that word effect unless you are making that claim. And if you're making that claim, you need to stand it up. So they haven't done that, but they have continued to use the word. And I think what they're saying there is that we would quite like, we're interested in whether it's causal, and these effects, this is what we want to find. The design of our study doesn't allow us to say that, but we're going to say it anyway. I don't know, perhaps that's being unkind to them. So why might this not be an effect of the principals' perceptions of their efficacy? In other words, principals who perceive that they're more effective or have higher efficacy, that leads to their schools doing better. Well, I think there's at least a couple of reasons, and this is just me making it up. I'm sure we could think of more if we did. But one is this thing called self-serving attribution bias, which basically just means all human beings tend to attribute positive things much more to themselves and things they can control, their own skill and knowledge and behavior. And we, this is all of us, attribute negative things much more to things that are outside of us. It wasn't my fault. It was, the situation I was in. So we all do this, and that, I think, could explain why principals in schools where the results are good are more likely to think it's because of what they do, and therefore that it's their efficacy that's brought it about. Whereas in lower performing schools, they think, oh well, school's not doing very well. It's not my fault. It's not, I don't have the power to influence this. Second reason is that it could be that in more challenging environments, in schools with more challenging groups of students, for example, lower socioeconomic, more disadvantaged, that the experience of being in that challenging environment makes people feel that they have less control over what's happening. Actually, they probably do have less control, so that might well be an accurate perception. But we also know that in those schools, the attainment tends to be lower. So that could be something else that causes both. Now, whether or not you think those are plausible explanations, I don't know. We could have a discussion about that. But all I'm saying is these are at least things that should be considered, shouldn't they, as a possibility that the causation is the other way around, or that both things are caused by something else. And then, of course, really to make a causal claim, you need to also show that efficacy is something you could in fact change. And if you what would you need to do to change it, and how much can we change it? If we can only change it a little bit, then I think it makes it less interesting. So, and there's a study there which is actually one of the randomized controlled trials of a leadership intervention, leadership training. And one of the things they found in that trial, Jacob et al., is that they did increase principals' feeling of efficacy, but that didn't actually lead to any change in attainment. So that suggests that maybe efficacy isn't a strong causal agent here. I'm not saying it's definitive, but I think at least gives us pause to think about that. Okay, now on to the slightly better stuff. This is a big review published quite recently this year. This is the same Grissom with two other colleagues. And this is a phenomenal achievement. They systematic review of a wide range of different studies. And there are a lot of studies, 495 studies coded. That's a colossal literature, of which 6 have this kind of panel data, in other words, repeated measures over time. And one of the things that they have in these studies is that they track multiple schools with multiple principals. So they can see when the change of principal happened in a particular school, or if a particular principal went to another school, we can track the same person. And they had some kind of outcome data in all those studies. And there are some more because their review is limited to studies in the US since 2000. I know of at least 3 others, 2 in Canada and 1 that was before 2000. There may well be others. And what they find is, using that kind of data, we can be clear that some principles definitely are more effective than others, and quite big effects, actually. So I think this is quite interesting. They also show that the impact of a principle has a bit of a lag in it. Again, people won't be surprised to hear that when a new principal comes into the school, most of the impact of a principal is probably indirect. It's through hiring and retaining good staff. It's through influencing the curriculum, the expectations, the culture in the school, and so on. Most of those things take a bit of time to feed through into student attainment. And one study tries to model that and find that they actually, principals, after 3 years, they've really only got to about half of their impact that they would have if they were left in post for more years, which I think is a really interesting finding, some good empirical evidence for that, as I say, quite sort of plausible thing. They also report in this Grissom et al. Study that the average tenure for principals in a particular school is only 4 years, and that's lower in high poverty schools. So most principals aren't really given enough time in post to actually have the impact that they would have. Obviously, if you're a good principal, that's a real shame. They also find that when there is a change, normally that's associated with a bit of a dip. But these studies are all, they describe them as black box in the sense that they don't really tell us much about what those principles did or anything about them. their characteristics. So we know that principals have a big effect. We don't really know why from those types of studies. There are some studies, though, again, it's taken from this same review, that are evaluations of programs to support principals, and they find 10 of these in this review. I suspect that probably is about all there are. And they split them into these two groups, whether they're aimed at new principals, to either sort of prior to becoming a principal the first time, aspiring principals, or whether they're new in post, supporting them. And they mostly consist of some training and support, ongoing support. And they find that the ones for new principals showed some effect, evidence of positive effect, and the one they say they basically didn't, so less likely to show evidence. That means no impact, I think. And maybe that's right. Maybe the new principal programs are more effective, but it seems to me, looking at those studies, that actually the better quality evaluations are in the wider group of programs that for anyone. So it might be that they're less effective, or it might just be that they've been better evaluated. And one of the things that I think we definitely need to rule out as an explanation is that they're quite selective, some of these programs, in fact, most of them. So you have to apply, which means you know that this is a worthwhile thing to do, and you're willing to learn as a principal and be supported. You have to pass a batch of selection tests, including knowledge of pedagogy and communication skills and interaction and all these kind of things that we think good leaders should be able to do. And then obviously you have to stay the whole course and complete it at the end. And I guess the question would be, do we think it's likely that people who do that, they apply, they pass the selection, and they graduate from the course, they might have been different from the people who didn't, even right at the beginning. So they're different. Their difference at the end may be partly because of what the course has done, but it might not be entirely that, because they were probably different at the beginning. So if we then find that they're more effective, which is what those studies of the new principals do, without random allocation, then we need to control for that, surely. And as far as I can see, none of those studies do control for that. So even when they find effects, I don't think we can really say that all of that effect is due to the program, and possibly none of it is. So that's a bit of a challenge. So what about this wider evidence about what it is that leaders do then? And there's a whole range of problems with this literature. I'm not sure I'm going to go through all this in a lot of detail, because I want to leave a bit of time for some questions and comments, but there's going to be a paper. I'm writing a paper on this, and it will all be in detail there, the arguments. But it's basically that they're correlational studies. The measures aren't very good. I've already talked about that. There's not enough theory, or not good theory, I think. So these are all the points I've already made, basically. But there are two good studies that I think are worth pointing out, and there's one is this one, which may be familiar. I think if I was in a room with a group of ResearchED attendees, I think I'd be asking for a show of hands who's heard of this study, and I'd expect quite a few hands to go up. I think it seems to have had a bit of publicity and circulation. This is about the growth trajectories of teachers, individual teachers, in schools that had different types of environments, and the characteristics of the environment are these things listed on the right there. And the schools that had those, so an ordered environment, focus on professional development, culture of trust and respect, and what I've called these are my words really more than theirs. They had 6 different headings for these and slightly different wordings. Constructive monitoring, so that's about performance management, but done in a way that's fair and supportive. And in those schools, teachers continue to grow from about year 3 through to year 10. That's the data they had. Whereas in the schools where we didn't see those characteristics, then the teachers basically flatlined. So having such a long time series there and having good data that matches individual teachers to their student attainment allows them to make, I think, a much stronger claim. So we know about these features of school environment, and I think these are related to leadership, although again, they may not be necessarily things that doesn't necessarily help us to tell leaders what they should do to achieve these things. Here's another study which I think is also really good, probably less well known. Again, I would ask for a show of hands, and I might be surprised to find that lots of people have seen this study, but Tony Bright and colleagues in Chicago, Carnegie, done this research over more than 10 years. I think they're tracking schools in Chicago and using surveys, and they found what they call these 5 effective supports. And under each of the 5 headings, there's a group of different things, which some of them, to my mind, look as though they do fit well under that heading, and others look as though it's slightly odd that they've put it there. But the key thing is that they've got all these things in there. I think there are 20 different characteristics under those 5 headings. So I think there's reasonable evidence that schools where these things are found, again, in their study, they had good attainment data with good control value added type data over many, many years, and they were able to say that these are the schools that improve. So from reading the wider literature, as I say, pretty much mostly correlational. So I'm not saying I think these things are necessarily important, but this is what comes out of the literature. I've got a list currently of 13 things. I may change because I'm still reading, actually. But my 13 are across 2 slides here. And again, just very, very briefly. So order, safety, discipline. This is about student behavior and support from school leadership on that. Other kinds of support, that teachers feel supported by school leaders, and it's responsive and leaders buffer them from problems. Focus on professional development is number 3, allocating time and budget to doing that. Effective evaluation. So yes, performance is evaluated, but it's done in a way that is supportive and fair and so on. Collaboration, teachers work together, support each other, and so on. And this feeling of agency, that teachers feel that they are responsible, that it's down to them whether students do well, they don't make excuses. And then 7 to 13 here, so high expectations. Number 7, demanding a lot from students, believing that's possible. Number 8 is about sharing that responsibility and giving teachers autonomy, distributed leadership. Number 9 is about well-being and feelings of job satisfaction and morale and so on. Stress or lack of stress. 10 is shared values, people sharing goals and mission and value alignment. Number 11 is about organization management, so just the kind of administration, budget, facilities, staffing and things like that. Strategic staffing is a bit different. This is about recruiting and retaining the best quality staff. And finally, community relationships with parents and the wider community. So that is the end of my talk.